I'm Sunny Efron, the president of National Press Foundation, and I'm really delighted to have with us today three very distinguished guests for our program on data and national security. Welcome to Cleet Willems, a partner at Aiken Gump Strauss, Hauer and Feld, who has also previously served in the White House as former Deputy Assistant for the President of International Economics and also Deputy Director of the National Economics Council. We're also delighted to welcome Adam Siegel. Adam is the Ira Littman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's also the author of The Right Way to Deal with Huawei, so we may get to that during this program. And welcome also to Lindsay Gorman, the Emerging Technologies Fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracies. We're broadcasting this morning from the Evelyn Y. Davis remote studio via Zoom. Journalists on the call, I want to remind you that if you're a journalist and you're on this call, you may want to be applying for the Heinrich Award for International Trade Reporting. The deadline is September 30th. Now is the moment to be asking for a letter of recommendation from your editor if you've forgotten that part. So thank you all. I'm going to turn first to, we've had an awful lot of news of the day over the weekend. So I'm going to turn first to Adam. Adam, if you could unmute yourself and just like everyone to comment a little bit on all the news we had this weekend with the legal shenanigans that are going on, and then we'll come back and our distinguished panelists will present. Adam, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So my my caveat is we're still waiting for the details, so hard to comment specifically, but my sense is that the deal for TikTok is pretty much a win for China and for TikTok. It does not, in my mind, so as again the details necessarily address the security concerns that the Trump administration expressed with the app, and many parts of the deal the Chinese today in the press basically said are not true. So the $5 billion the contribution, the president's insistence that the company will no longer have any Chinese ownership, all those things we've seen pushback from the Chinese side. So right now, my sense is it's kind of a deal that really doesn't address the concerns that the Trump administration said they had with security.
Okay, so it's 2020, the facts are murky, and China is winning. I guess that's a pretty consistent theme through this year. Let me turn it over to you, Lindsay, if you would comment on the weekend's events.
Thanks, Sunny, and happy to be here. I would largely agree with that assessment that in particular with regards to the TikTok deal, we've as yet seen no evidence that it resolves the underlying national security concerns, some of which were articulated by the Trump administration and some of which were not. And as I'll talk about later on in my presentation, I think it's important that we are explicit about the risks that we're talking about. In this case, we had a risk of data security and a risk of information influence, and it's unclear that those were resolved. We also know that the deal in its current form, at least as we know now, will have about 80% ownership by ByteDance, so that's the Chinese parent company of TikTok, whereas what the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and what the Trump administration had previously been pushing for was really a complete sale. So suffice it to say, those goals were not met. For China, it's looking pretty good. ByteDance gets to retain the majority of that ownership. We suspect that some of these national security concerns from the White House will go away. And there's been a host of confusion over whether there are these unrelated economic attachments to this deal, namely a fund for education, AI-enabled education that actually ByteDance and TikTok would be part of. So they may even have a new business opportunity in the United States as a result of this, in addition to creating some potentially problematic linkages with US companies that actually this national security process was really designed to address in the first place. And then I'll just briefly comment also on the development involving WeChat over the weekend, which was that a California magistrate judge issued a temporary injunction on the ban of WeChat that was supposed to take effect yesterday. And what was interesting to me about this particular ruling, I think it will be contested heavily by the federal government, but it actually drew on First Amendment grounds to make its point, essentially arguing from a complaint from WeChat users that because WeChat is one of the only platforms available to Chinese Americans, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case, but this was the ruling, because WeChat is one of the only platforms available to Chinese Americans, therefore its removal would deprive that community of a First Amendment free speech right. So there's an incredible irony here that, due in part to the fact that China bans other apps, WeChat is somehow granted some First Amendment protection. So I expect there to be a number of challenges on that front, but that's kind of where we are with the WeChat ban as well.
Okay, Clete, over to you. Could you talk
Sure.
also about the legal battle that's going on? How does this work on the appeals court? You know, is this thing going to be tied up in litigation, you know, until well after the election?
Sure, thank you. Let me first say, you know, I find this whole conversation a little bit ironic. It's kind of like a darned if you do and darned if you don't kind of situation. So, you know, on one hand, the administration is getting criticized for potentially banning these apps in the US, and now they're getting criticized because the deal that they've cut is too weak. I mean, look, the bottom line is there are legitimate security issues here that need to be confronted. And it is difficult to draw these lines in the right ways. And what they're doing right now with TikTok and WeChat is going to be highly precedential, because the kinds of concerns we're talking about, and I'll get into this a little bit later, concerns about data, concerns about surveillance, concerns about propaganda, those apply to a broad range of Chinese companies. And this really is just the tip of the iceberg. And so how they draw these lines is going to be incredibly important. On TikTok itself, you know, we don't have all the details quite yet. The Treasury Department said over the weekend that this is still subject to CFIUS. If you read very closely, the Commerce Department didn't eliminate the ban on TikTok, or the elements of TikTok that were going to be banned on September 20th. They simply punted them for a week so they could try to work out these details. So we're not done yet, and I think we need to reserve judgment until we have all the details. But what we know for sure is that the status quo will not persist, and that stronger measures will be put in place that the administration, via CFIUS, believes will be sufficient, or CFIUS won't approve it. And that's what we're going to find out over the next couple of days. So I think we just need to be cautious there before we jump to conclusions. But I will grant you, this is not easy. And I'm certain that there were folks in the administration on both sides of this issue trying to figure out what is the right balance. On WeChat, again, I mean, the big point I'd leave you all with is this is just the tip of the iceberg. And you're going to see this coming for a lot more companies. You know, on WeChat, you know, you already have India and Australia who have moved to ban it for some of the same concerns as the United States. Now, our courts, again, are looking at this very closely. As I understand, it's a very fluid situation. I think the administration is going to appeal the decision. I haven't read into it this morning to know exactly when and how that's going to happen, but I do expect that they're going to look for a pretty quick resolution here, because the remedy that was imposed, a nationwide injunction, is pretty broad, and I think the administration does have underlying national security concerns, so I don't think the court's going to want to let that sit forever, including through the election. I think on both of these issues, we are going to have more clarity before the election comes. And my last point here, and I'll get into this as well, this stuff isn't going away no matter who wins in November. This is not just a Trump issue. There's a broad bipartisan consensus. And if you look at the commentary from the Democrats on this, you know, some of them are saying what our other speakers said, which is too weak. So we're going to be dealing with this issue for years to come.
Okay, before we go into the presentation, I just want to clarify for those who are new to this issue on CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and you had a lot of dealings with that committee, correct? Could you talk about, can they have a separate process from the Commerce Department? Could you just explain that fact for everyone on the call?
Sure, that was a question for me.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the legal status of these parallel. You seem to indicate that there were two parallel legal processes, so I just wanted to clarify the legality of how this process is going to play out in the next couple of weeks.
Correct. So with respect to TikTok, not WeChat, with respect to TikTok, because their parent company, ByteDance, made an investment in Musical.ly, they were initially then subject to CFIUS review. And CFIUS, of course, reviews investments in US companies. And so that process started, and then CFIUS recommended that there had to be a divestment. And through the process of looking at that, they can do different types of actions that would mitigate the national security threat, and that's what they're working on. Now, independent of this, there's a parallel track, which the legal authority for it is under IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And under this, the president has declared a national emergency with respect to foreign adversaries that can get data on Americans and a whole range of different things through information and communication technology services. Now, using that legal justification, Commerce Department, the president said WeChat and TikTok pose a specific threat, and then the Commerce Department was supposed to specify which kinds of transactions were actually prohibited. So Commerce and Treasury, with respect to the TikTok issue, are proceeding in parallel, and they're basically racing to figure out, can we get a solution through CFIUS, which would preclude us from having to enact this ban through Commerce. And so I know it can be a little bit confusing, and it is a bit unprecedented, but they are separate proceedings that are taking place. CFIUS trying to resolve the concerns there such that Commerce doesn't have to move forward here. But in any event, the status quo with respect to TikTok is unlikely to be the same at the end of the road.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying. I think that's difficult for people who are trying to cover and follow this issue. So Adam, initially we asked you to come on and brief reporters about data and national security and give us kind of an overview of how do we evaluate these dangers and how do we think in a 30,000 foot view about what is coming down the line. And I agree with, I think everyone agrees with Cleet that this issue is not going away in the next administration. So over to you.
I will slightly distinguish myself perhaps from what Cleet, I think where the direction he's going and perhaps where Lindsay is going, is that my criticism of it being weak is in some part because the Trump administration has defined this as a national security problem, which I am not certain it is. I certainly think it is a data security problem. But if you're going to say it's a national security problem, then the response certainly looks weak. I think there are, when we think about China and cyber and digital threats, I think there are at least 4 different types. And so I'm going to try to lay them out here. In my mind, the kind of national security threat goes left to right, although we could probably move information operations a little bit in. But right now, the threats go left to right. And so the largest national security threat is the one that we've seen for the last decade and a half, which is the theft of data through cyber-enabled hacking and operations. So the most recent one that came out, of course, is CloudHopper, which looks at hacking of IT services and cloud services, but OPM, Anthem, Equifax, attacks on the press, NGOs, Tibetan Uyghur activists. So that is what, the primary threat on data, the national security data threat, as we've seen. It's been widespread. The campaigns have been very well developed. We've seen the move from the PLA to the Ministry of State Security. The US government response has primarily been through indictments and naming and shaming. And perhaps Cyber Command has done some disruption under its new more forward-leaning strategy of defend forward. We don't know for certain because most of the public evidence about that strategy has been about Russians hacking and influence operations. The second category of threat I would call supply chain threat. And here the threat is both of espionage and coercion or disruption. So if we allow Huawei to build out 5G networks, do they both steal the data or eventually turn off certain systems in case there's some political conflict? Here we've seen, both the U.S. blocking 5G inside of domestic networks, and then pressuring allies, convincing allies, working with allies not to use Huawei for its 5G. The most successful tool has been the entity list, which in May of this year was revised again and really cut off Huawei from semiconductors and other technologies that the U.S. Semiconductor automation and semiconductor design, which is really an area the United States dominates on, and has really kneecapped Huawei as it moves forward. The third is where I think TikTok comes in, which is this concern about big data and data collection going to Chinese firms, and the reality that under the National Intelligence Law of 2017, Chinese firms appear to have to cooperate with the Chinese government for espionage or counter-espionage purposes. And so the issue is, what data are they holding? Can it then be matched with the first category of data that's collected in other type of hacking? Can you use other types of artificial intelligence or big data to then use it for approaching possible people to turn them into spies or in counterintelligence or in other types of spying? So that we see around TikTok. We see that surveillance on WeChat. It was behind the decision to force the Grindr deal to be unwound and Beijing Kunlun to have to sell its share. There's a huge market in third-party sellers of adware, which we haven't talked about at all. So lots of personal data floating around the Chinese market that we haven't talked about any regulating in any way, shape, or form. But the tools that the U.S. government has talked about, as was Cleet mentioned, is the CFIUS process and IAPA, and a lot of this has come under the State Department's Clean Networks Initiative. And then finally, is this concern about as more and more Americans use Chinese social media platforms? Because I agree with Cleet, this is not the first one, not the end of what is probably going to be a wave. What do we know about how that information is either censored or used for influence or propaganda? So certainly stories about how TikTok was treating data about or posts about Hong Kong and Uyghurs and others. And we know the Chinese have been exploiting our own platforms on Twitter and Facebook. And so far the response has been, again, focused on TikTok and WeChat through the State Department's Clean Network Initiative and CFIUS and IAPA. And then the social media platforms themselves, now when you interact with CCTV or any of the Chinese public media, it comes with a little check mark saying that it's a Chinese state media. So efforts to expose Chinese influence on our own platforms. So again, you asked for kind of a typology of the threats. This is how I think of them. Lindsay and Cleet might have a different breakdown. So again, my sense is from a national security perspective, the biggest threat so far has primarily been the hacking. TikTok, in my mind, is a data and privacy threat. It has not, in my mind, reached the level of national security threat. And I will end by just saying, yes, the Democrats are going to do many of the same things. There's no doubt that these issues are going to continue if Biden wins the election. There's going to be a certain continuity there. And we have not seen the Chinese response yet. So that the point I will end with is that we're still waiting to see what the Chinese will do. They've been fairly restrained. I think they will be restrained about TikTok because, as I said, I think they will, and they're already packaging it as a win. But this weekend, the Chinese finally published the details on the entity list, their own entity list, and how it might be applied. And its categories for application are extremely broad. So anyone that affects the security of supply chains in China, sovereignty issues, national security issues, so a whole range of things that the Chinese can use to respond if they want to.
Adam, thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Cleet to talk about the national security issues as you see them. And Cleet, we've focused primarily on China. But could you also say a few words on how you see this playing out with Russia and also with non-adversaries that nevertheless collect data in ways that some people consider to be very threatening? And since it's election season, I'll just mention Cambridge Analytica, again, a British company, not on the list, not in the crosshairs, but one that, you know, many people were thought were, you know, was very threatening to U.S. Election security and therefore national security. So over to you.
Sure, thank you. And Adam, I enjoy your presentation very much. I apologize, I don't have a really nice visual for everyone. But I thought Adam did a good job of laying out sort of all the different facets of this and what some of the concerns are, you know, that have been articulated by this administration, and again, I think would be articulated by a subsequent administration. So we'll just call it, you know, the concerns articulated by the U.S. government. You know, and I don't want to get too caught up in the semantics of what's national security and what's data security. I mean, I think the bottom line is, you know, we can sit here and argue about sort of what the right tools are or what the right thing to call it is, but our government does perceive a threat that's manifest in a couple of different ways. And I was struck on Friday, and some of the journalists on here might have gotten some of the same briefings as I did from our government, but they really focused, I think, on three issues when they talked about why they needed to do what they were doing with TikTok and WeChat, and this is in terms of the IEPA order, and also, you know, sort of explained why it was unique to China. So let me touch on that for a minute. I mean, the three things that they really focused on are data collection, which again, I know is the subject of this, but I would posit is sort of in some ways not the preeminent national security concern, although it is a concern. And, you know, one of the reasons that they articulated the data collection as being a concern was this notion of blackmail, something used by intelligence services around the world. You get sensitive information about people, whether it's health information, whether, financial information, and then you use it to develop sources. And I do think that that's an element of data collection that's undervalued in this discussion. I also think there's the issue of artificial intelligence and simply the competition between the US and China to be better at artificial intelligence. So we're better at military stuff. And that if China's companies are collecting more data than ours, we're at a disadvantage. So there's sort of a national security element there. It's a very broad one. I mean, it really applies to almost any Chinese company, including those that the US thinks have linkages to the government, to the military, which they do think here. So there's so data collection, again, just one part of it. The other part of it, Adam also touched on this in a couple of different ways, is espionage and surveillance. And one of the things the government was talking about, in particular with WeChat, was the surveillance of Chinese, formerly Chinese citizens who are now in the United States. And I think one of the things they mentioned in their August 6th executive order is that they had uncovered a database in China of all the WeChat messages for all Chinese citizens living abroad. So you have some real surveillance issues here that they're worried about, in addition to the ability to put backdoors into a lot of this stuff, including into the source code. And then the third one that the government is focused on is propaganda. And, both propaganda in terms of through the TikTok interface or WeChat's social media interface, sort of pushing out, different viewpoints that they want to be heard by American citizens. And Russia, does this as well as China. I mean, potentially divisive, trying to cause division in our society. But then there's the question of censorship. And are these Chinese platforms promoting a view of the world or censoring a view of the world that's different than what the Communist Party wants people to see? And that is a real concern here for the US government. And they talked about all three of those things. Now, they apply to China, I think, in a special way. And this sort of gets to the question, I'm going to touch on Europe for a second. I know in sort of the lead up to this event, there was some discussion of how is Europe's approach different than the issue? How is Europe's approach to US companies different than the US concerns about Chinese companies? And I would say there's a couple big reasons, but let me give you three very clear ones. The first one is the track record that these Chinese companies have. I mentioned one example on WeChat. There's lots of other examples where Chinese companies actually have been caught doing things like this. Number two, there's the national intelligence law, which I think is very important in terms of just giving the Chinese government the ability to have Chinese companies essentially do whatever they need in accordance with their national security interests. And quite frankly, we don't have anything quite like that in the United States. And when you hear from Europe saying we're concerned about U.S. spying, right? Because that's some of the justification that they give. It's not that U.S. companies are collecting data on behalf of the U.S. government. It's a very different situation. And so there's that national intelligence law and the fact that we believe that Chinese companies will act at the behest of their government whenever asked. And that is a key distinction between them. And then the third one is just the whole nature of the Chinese government itself. The fact that it is not a democracy. They don't have free speech in the same way. And so there is this concern that these companies are both linked to the government and that they will utilize or they will use propaganda and censorship to further their aims. So again, those are very different ways to look at it. I will say though, the US is also very concerned about what's going on in Europe. And we can get into this as well if we have time. You have a situation where Europe is also looking at restricting US companies right now. So the way I've always understood it is not that they're worried about Google or Facebook or whomever, sort of spying and, on behalf of the US government, but rather there's sort of the individualized privacy right. But then there's also this question of the value of the data. And do these companies gain some value by having all of this data? And why shouldn't Europe share in that value? That seems to be the sentiment. Now, from a US lens, we are very worried that it sounds like industrial policy protectionism and the fact that we've got these great big tech companies in the US, Europe doesn't have them, and we need to extract some money from them so we can build our own national competitors. And when you look at what Europe is doing on data and digital sovereignty, from a US government perspective, it looks a little bit like it is an attempt to build a competitive EU, a set of competitors within the EU. So again, I look at that as more of an economic issue, a personalized privacy issue, and not the same type of national security issue that you see going back and forth between the US and China. I don't want to go on too long. We can get into all these issues. I just want to comment on one thing that Adam said sort of about the Chinese response. My view overall is that we are going to have, I'm going to use the word relative, relative calm between now and election day. I think that, from China's perspective, people can argue whether this is right or wrong. But I believe the U.S. intelligence agencies, when they say they think China would like to see Joe Biden elected as president to bring some more predictability to the situation, and they do believe that they will get a better shake from him than they've gotten from President Trump. People can argue whether that's right or wrong. That's what our intelligence community has said. I do think that's right. And I do think, therefore, China's going to resist from really casting the die on the strongest actions against U.S. companies because they want to see if they can reverse this thing in a couple of months. But the unreliable entities framework did come out over the weekend, which was a clear response to what the U.S. is doing here. And I would just say as a final comment, I also find it a little bit ironic to talk about Chinese retaliation at all, because as we'll recall, how many U.S. companies like this? If the U.S. had started TikTok, it wouldn't have been allowed in China in the first place. There wouldn't have been a need to ban it because they never would have allowed it to operate. And you look at Twitter, you look at Google, all these companies are out of the Chinese market because they won't censor and therefore they're not allowed in the market. So I just, the notion of retaliation, I think in some sense is a misnomer. China's already closed its market down to these kinds of companies from the U.S. And again, they may take some actions pursuant to the unreliable entities list, but I think it'll be pretty muted between now and November.
Okay, well, thank you for this fascinating overview. Lindsay, we'll turn to you in a minute. I know you have a very different perspective on some of these issues. I just want to say, journalists on the call, you have two ways to ask questions. You can drop them in the chat, and you can also raise your Zoom hand, and we will try to get in as many questions as possible. So please have at. All right, let me turn it over to Lindsay. Lindsay, do you want to talk about your view of this, but also can you address the issue of this not merely being a US-China issue and a Europe issue, but we also have the Russians playing in different areas in this. And we had the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, last week testifying about Russian intervention in the election. So all of this is very fraught. Over to you to give us clarity.
Thanks, sure. And I think those were very helpful overviews. I'd like to start by giving maybe the 300,000 foot view of the situation, which the way I see it is really that the United States and its democratic allies and partners are in a global information contest with authoritarian states like Russia and China. And that's really the overarching lens that a lot of these digital struggles can be seen through. And this is a fundamental difference in the way democracies and autocracies handle and process information. Information in democracies is essential to the functioning of the democratic society, for selecting our political leaders, for engaging in democratic discourse. In autocracies, it's something to be weaponized and to be controlled and used at the behest of the state. And that's what we've seen from many of these countries. You mentioned Russia in particular, weaponizing information to undermine our democracy. And in some sense, there are asymmetries in this contest, because for the United States and for democracies, information should not be a weapon. We support independent journalism. We don't support the twisting and the weaponization of information. We support a free and open exchange of ideas, but we're running into some problems where disinformation has taken off, and sometimes those ideas are the facts are not actually rising to the top. So this is an asymmetric battle space that democracies have to confront. And when we think about it in the context of Chinese tech, this information contest really consists of, I think, three planes. One is the use or manipulation of information itself, the data or the content. And my colleagues have referred to especially the data part of this, and I think that's essential. And the interplay between data and content is only going to get closer and closer in the sort of Internet of Everything era, when data-driven systems, the Internet of Things, are suddenly going to become content displayers. Think about autonomous cars that not only run on data to find the right traffic patterns, but also are displaying advertising systems and vehicular entertainment systems, in the words of one Chinese standard, as you're driving or not driving. So information and content is going to be part of this world in a way that I don't think we are seeing right now. The second part of this is really the architecture. So that's, when we talk about Huawei, when we talk about 5G, the underlying pipes, if you will, the systems, the platforms, or the companies that transmit information and control the speeds, the flows, the directions of that data. And then lastly, thirdly, the governance frameworks, which include the laws, the standards, and the norms for this content, data, and technology. And especially in that last area is where there's this fundamental difference between how democracies act and how autocracies do. And I would posit that part of the goal of US foreign policy should be to extenuate those distinctions as opposed to close them. So we're entering an era where by 2025, there are estimates that there will be 175 zettabytes of data in the global data sphere. That's an incredibly large amount that I think we can't even right now understand what the implications of that data will be. And so I think inherent in this conversation, we've treated data as a resource. We need to secure data. As Cleet mentioned, data can be used as input to artificial intelligence systems. And so data is not just about making systems work better, but it really is becoming a fundamental element of national power. And part of that is economic power, the success of these AI systems, the competitiveness of companies in democracies and authoritarian states alike. And part of it is also military power. Part of it is soft power, information influence that can accrue from this data. And that's where the personal data elements come in. You can think of precisely targeted influence operations if you know what someone has for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and when they take their walks and what they shop for. And right now, much of this data is used in the United States and in the West for capitalistic purposes to sell us things. In China and increasingly in Russia, it's being used for control. But either way, the data is power in the 21st century, and we're going to be seeing much more of that power. So I think there's an interesting question over this interplay and overlap between economic power and military power and national security, because as we ratchet up our economic power, we all of a sudden have more geopolitical leverage. And in fact, in particular, in the case of China, we've seen China weaponize its economy to exert geopolitical control. This has been taking place over the course of the coronavirus pandemic, particularly around the origins of the virus, with threats on Australia and other countries to withhold trade. And it's a particularly powerful tool. So I think there's been a tendency previously to think of the economic and national security spheres as separate, but I think that's becoming harder and harder, and that's also what we're seeing around these questions of data. As well, data abuse is a real threat to freedom, to democracy, to civil liberties. The digital authoritarianism that was on Adam's first slide is really this data for control model that is becoming a feature of 21st century authoritarianism. In Brazil, they're using Huawei predictive police technology to, and I quote, anticipate crime before it happens. So think Minority Report. But potentially even arresting people before the crime happens. Obviously, that's something that really goes against democratic governance. And why this is related to data and national security, it's because you have networks of facial recognition, of GPS tracking, of data on a population, even genetic data in some cases, that are used to track populations. And obviously, the most egregious example of this is in Xinjiang, where we have a mounting genocide and companies that are enabling it. And so I would add sort of that global human rights, national security or foreign policy risk that we have to be mindful of, that as democracies and as companies in democracies, that we're not inadvertently abetting those types of extreme abuses. So I also took your direction to come up with sort of a typology of information-based national security threats. And I think there's a temptation to conflate a range of concerns with information apps into security threats, and also to over-focus on the data espionage piece of this. And I think, if policymakers aren't clear about the threats that they're addressing, they can't really be clear on the solutions and whether the concerns have been mitigated. And so I see really 4 central threats that one can break down into a number of categories. And those are, firstly, data exfiltration and security. Second, information influence. Third, infrastructural influence. And fourth, global human rights. And so in that first bucket of data exfiltration and security, I think the questions, when we have a data security question, I mean, there's so much data that's being collected at any given moment in an information app like TikTok or WeChat, or in your web browser or your phone, across a number of apps that are both US based, that are Chinese, that are European based. We're in the business model of data these days, so that's pretty much inescapable. But so when you're evaluating, is this data security question really a national security threat, and what do I need to be concerned about? I think the first question is, what type of data are you looking at? Is this personal data? Is this corporate data? Is this national security relevant data? The national security concerns for a person in a position of public trust or holding a security clearance or in a national security relevant position are going to be slightly different from the average citizen. That doesn't mean that there aren't concerns in both cases, but if you're a holder of a US security clearance, then what you're worried about is data exfiltration from your devices, you're worried about blackmail, you're worried about national security sensitive information being exfiltrated out to a foreign power that may or may not be friendly to the United States, or apply this to any country that you may be in. Now, I mean, if you're the average person though, you say, well, I don't really care who has all my data. Google and Apple, they all have it anyway, and that's probably true. Oh, and by the way, the Equifax hack probably got a bunch more, and if everyone has my data anyway, what's the big deal about that? And so there, the concern isn't so much the direct blackmail consideration that you as an individual are going to be somehow surrendering sensitive US government information that you probably don't have yourself. But really, I think there's sort of an influence concern and also a censorship concern there with sort of the average American or the average citizen. If you imagine there are so many sort of creative scenarios that you can imagine, but I mean, taking health data, I think, as a particular example, because it's one that has long been protected with privacy, with HIPAA. There are reasons that citizens care about protecting sensitive personal information, applying for jobs, their personal reputations, you name it. And it's not so much that the Chinese government will necessarily blackmail you with that information into somehow stealing classified information, but what if every time you post something about Xinjiang or something counter to the Chinese government, you get a little warning that says, well, by the way, we have this information on you. This is kind of the more longer term risks that I think we have to be concerned about, in addition to the more economic asymmetry in China amassing the world's data, and that really does come from the government using these information platforms, not just TikTok and WeChat, but also video conferencing platforms to amass data to train artificial intelligence systems. And in the case of corporate data, now you might say, well, I work at this company with very sensitive information, so then my personal data is also relevant to this question about the security of my sensitive intellectual property. And certainly on the corporate data level, the United States and many democracies are really being hit hard by Chinese intellectual property theft. The American Commission on IP Theft has estimated that trade secret theft costs between 1% and 3% of the United States GDP, meaning that's a cost of $18 trillion to the U.S. economy. The cost of the $18 trillion U.S. economy is between 180 billion and 540 billion per year. And China is the world's worst IP infringer, and accounts for approximately 80% of the cases that the Department of Justice has brought, the National Security Division has brought since 2012. And I bet that statistic is even higher now, given the recent indictments that have come down over the last couple of months. So the corporate data is another angle of this when you're asking the question of what type of data. I think the second question you have to ask, that I alluded to, is really whose data? Is this a national security professional? Is this a citizen in a democracy? Is this a citizen in a less free state? The surveillance concerns for a citizen in a democracy and for a citizen outside a democracy are going to be different and should be weighed slightly differently, depending on where you are. And I think that's something that comes into play with WeChat, where many of these users span China and the United States, and there are concerning linkages that some may be subject to less democratic civil liberties protections. So the second kind of information-based threat in this typology is about information influence, and that's targeted political influence, disinformation, and also selective censorship, which I think in the case of TikTok is actually particularly concerning, not because we've seen so many overt examples, but I think we've seen enough less overt examples that we really need to be raising some eyebrows on the information influence threat here. I think it's very tempting, and I've seen a number of articles that have come out saying that, well, TikTok is just a fun cat meme singing video kind of platform, but increasingly it's being used for political speech in the United States, and the idea that it would remain as such, I think, ignores the trends of the popularity of that platform. We've already seen evidence that TikTok was preferentially suppressing content related to the Black Lives Matter movement, that if you looked at videos related to the Hong Kong protests last year across all other social media platforms, there were myriad. On TikTok, there were very, very few. And one of, I think, the biggest challenges with a platform like TikTok, and ones that we may see going forward, is the opacity of these algorithms. And in particular with TikTok, it's not like YouTube, where on YouTube, at least you see what's up next. On TikTok, you don't even see that. So you're being shown these videos, you have no idea why, and this For You algorithm, kind of the secret sauce of the TikTok platform, has really figured out what you want to see and what keeps you there. The problem is that it's actually very, very hard technically to test whether content is actually being censored, whether it's being suppressed preferentially. You don't have to outright remove a video to not show it. So bringing that to the context of Russian influence in 2016, and what we've now seen that China is doing across all three main US social media platforms that are owned by US companies, Twitter, Facebook, and also YouTube, the idea that China would not try to influence the information environment on a platform that it essentially controls and where the algorithm is completely opaque, I think is a little bit naive. So that I think that information influence concern is one where it's not clear to me that we have great ways of dealing with it, even if there's some oversight, as we might see in this deal, on the data security risks. It's going to be very difficult without demanding greater transparency on some of these algorithms to assess whether that information influence is happening, because it could happen in very subtle ways. And then thirdly, on the infrastructural influence piece, Adam touched on this, so I won't spend too long on it, but this is kind of the main concern with Huawei, the geopolitical dependence building. And I would say that this is absolutely not a theoretical risk at all. And we have evidence of China using geopolitical dependence to advance its own aims. Back in 2016, when Vietnam rejected a number of China's claims to the South China Sea, the response was a slew of cyber attacks on airports in Vietnam, in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, took the computers down for hours, and flight attendants and gate agents were checking people in manually. So there's a clear interest in using cyber attacks for geopolitical leverage. And then finally, to wrap up, there's this issue of global human rights, and I think this particularly comes into play with WeChat, when the concern, which I would like to see articulated more strongly by the U.S. government, that which of these threats WeChat is really that the ban is really supposed to address. But certainly we know that WeChat, like many information platforms in China, is a source of surveillance, and more than that, of jailing journalists and activists based on their comments on that platform. So I think those are sort of the four big categories. There are a number of ways that the US and its democratic partners have tried to counter it, but I would just say briefly that on kind of the question of Europe, one thing that is curious to me and that I'm wondering, particularly in the TikTok case, is that the Europeans have a framework, a data protection framework that's in theory supposed to help adjudicate some of these decisions. And in fact, TikTok is going through some of these investigations right now. And so I think there's a real question on whether these vendor neutral frameworks and country neutral frameworks are sufficient to address some of these authoritarian technology challenges.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much. We've had a really broad discussion here. I want to open it up to questions. Again, you can drop a question in the chat or you can raise your Zoom hand. I just want to turn it back from the 300,000 foot level very low down. There's talk that Facebook is starting its own version of TikTok. Let's just, for the purposes of this discussion, assume that TikTok and the Chinese ownership of TikTok is off the table. Now we have the same app owned by an American company with all of the human rights and all of the data collection, economic security, national security, blackmail, all the other issues we raised. Adam, would you use an American version of TikTok? And would you let your kids use it? And I'll ask everybody else the same question.
Well, I'm not on Facebook, but that is primarily for privacy issues. But my children are on TikTok, and I don't really have a problem with them being on TikTok. So yes, my kids are on Instagram. It's the same thing, I don't have a problem with them being on Instagram. So the version of TikTok is Instagram that exists right now. So I don't have a problem.
Cleet, how about if you have kids of that age, would you let them on TikTok?
They're not quite there yet, but they will be one day. I mean, look, I think the concerns is I articulated, Adam articulated, and Lindsay articulated. They're real concerns with TikTok, and a lot of it has to do with the linkages to the Chinese government as well as the opaqueness of the algorithms. And so I would be concerned about TikTok. I would not be concerned about a U.S. company that provided the same services. I think there is a clear distinction there.
Okay, Lindsay, would you let your kids on TikTok or an American version? Leaving TikTok aside, would you let them on a U.S. version of TikTok, a Facebook-owned version of TikTok, or whatever company?
I would. I probably wouldn't personally use it. I think there are, privacy concerns, but I think that some of the national security concerns would be alleviated by a wholly separate and US-owned platform. I think there are certainly loopholes, especially in the way that US companies secure information, sell it to data brokers. There are ways for the Chinese government, I think, to get a lot of this data. But I would at least take solace in the fact that the ultimate owner of the company was not on a mission to collect the world's data and use it to surveil, censor, and potentially jail parts of its population, or at least where it would be limited by U.S. law. Okay,
thank you. So back to a question on the legalities, and I think this is for both you, Adam, and Cleet. And correct us if we're wrong, we think that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act for this executive order, that this was the first time that this was used, but probably not for the last time. If we have a Biden administration, will it continue to issue this sort of executive order? And should, in other spheres of American life, there have been a lot of fights over, overuse of executive order. Should the administration be doing this? I understand this is considered a national emergency for now, but is this going to become a precedent, and should it become a precedent? Adam or Cleet, whichever one of you, or maybe both of you want to take that one.
Sure, I can go first. I mean, first on IEEPA, just to be clear, it's been utilized. It underlies a lot of our sanctions in the United States. So it's not unprecedented to use IEEPA. What is unprecedented is to use IEEPA against a digital application you have on your cell phone. Look, and I take your point about the EOs and sort of, I don't mean to be too pragmatic about it, but I feel like whoever's in power going to use the authority they have, and whoever's out of power is going to complain about it. Kind of what we see happening on the Supreme Court right now. And, you know, so I think you're going to continue to see it. I think the Biden administration, if there is a Biden administration, I do think that they would go down this path. You know, my general view is that there might be a little more predictability in the way they roll things out, more of a thorough interagency process. Maybe less of it will play out in the press with different advisors with different views. But at the end of the day, you know, my colleagues, I think, articulated better than I did the wide reason of wide rationale for this. And I don't think the U.S. government is going to sit on its hands, no matter who's president.
Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Clete. I think the presidents are going to use executive orders. That's what helps them get things done quickly, and especially if they're facing a hostile Congress. And you know, President Obama issued several executive orders to deal with cyber and digital issues. I guess, you know, in my mind, the fact that this was declared an international emergency, you know, it does not seem to me to be, again, even if you accept that there is a security risk, national security risk, you know, what was the emergency part of it? It had been existing for quite a while. So I suspect that, you know, the process will differ as we move forward, but the tools will still be from the executive agency. And I think there'll be less of a convergence of economic security and national security, or at least, again, it'll go through a different process. So we'll have a different set of criteria in place.
Okay. Let me turn to a question from a journalist in the United Kingdom, Paul Dinsdale. How can the US and the EU reconcile their different approaches to data security, i.e. more emphasis on privacy in Europe and more on national security in the US? Will we need a change of president? I mean, how would you address that, Adam? Clete was just very critical of Europe, essentially, for using you know, privacy as a stalking horse to do industrial policy and to disadvantage U.S. tech companies. How would you speak to those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, as Clete expressed, there is a long-term concern that GDPR is often used, or other regulation is often used, for economic reasons. But I do think there is a growing demand in the United States for national privacy laws and national breach laws, and getting something closer to GDPR. And you can see that the shift in the attitude towards the tech firms, the platforms themselves, right? Especially after California passed its security law, they are concerned that, you know, the California law will become the standard, and so they want to help shape a national privacy law. So I think we are moving in that direction. There is, I think, pretty broad support. You know, look, we're seeing discussions about regulating the media platforms, both from the left and from the right now, for different reasons, but we're definitely talking about that. And so I think we will get there. I think there is, as like I said, I think there is a move on both on the regulatory and the legislative front to create national laws in the U.S.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on this for a second. I mean, for folks who aren't aware, I mean, Republicans in the Senate, Senator Wicker, you know, they introduced a broad privacy bill just on Thursday. You know, for some of the reasons Adam mentioned, really trying to, you know, they anticipate that something like this could be coming, and really wanted to lay down a Republican marker on what it could look like. I think on the Dem side, I mean, there's a lot of positive talk about the CCPA in California. And I think, you know, look, U.S. companies do recognize that privacy is really important to people, and I think are already taking steps in the United States to try to address that. You know, but I will say, I mean, it seems you can sit here and think about it logically and say, you know, Republicans really love privacy, Democrats love regulation. Why can't we just get this done? You know, we've been having these conversations for about 15 years. So, you know, I don't know. But I can say that there is at least some momentum on both sides. And I think the U.S. companies realize this is important for consumers and that they're moving in that direction as well. On Europe, I'll just say, look, the U.S. and the EU need to figure out how to reconcile their differences on this and on many other issues. Because again, I think the threat that we pose to each other, or even if you want to call it a threat, the differences between us are maybe economic based, maybe somewhat of sort of the way that we regulate privacy. But the threat that from China and from Russia, has been articulated today is a real national security threat, and we've got to figure out a way to work together. I do push back a little bit on the notion, though, that it's just, there's going to be a new administration and suddenly, it's going to be kumbaya between the U.S. and the EU. We have some real differences here, and Joe Biden is not going to be cool with regulations from Europe that discriminate against U.S. companies. He's just not. And so there's still going to be tension. I'm hopeful that whoever is president, whoever wins this election, we can work together better with Europe. Let's not brush aside some of the true differences here we have. Hopefully we can get past them and really focus on the common.
Okay.
Yeah, I would also add to that, sort of on the second half of that question, that I think an encouraging sign is we have seen Europe come a little bit closer to the U.S. position on China over the last really 6 months since the pandemic. There has been an awakening on the continent, and I think in the UK as well. It seems like a lot of the coronavirus mask diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy on Twitter has actually spectacularly backfired on China. They've somehow squandered this sort of leadership moment where the U.S. coronavirus response faltered. And so I think there is, in whatever window it may be, a real opportunity for the United States and the EU and the UK to work together on addressing the common threat from China. On the US side, there are movements towards more data privacy frameworks and calls from technology companies themselves. And in particular, I think there's also a greater awareness in the United States side on the threat of intellectual property theft, and perhaps a clear line to be drawn between the economic cost of that espionage and breach notification laws. There was a study done out of NPR and Frontline last year that basically found a tragedy of the commons problem in the United States response to Chinese-enabled cyber IP theft, in that companies weren't actually reporting it to the Department of Justice, who would then hold these companies, hold China or affiliated entities accountable, because A, it was a bad look to shareholders to say, hi, I've been hacked. And B, they're worried about business interests in China. So while I think that there are a number of provisions of GDPR that may not be directly applicable to the US context, and certainly they've struggled in Europe with enforcement. One in particular is the breach notification requirement, within 72 hours of learning of a breach. Not saying you have to necessarily go public with it, but at least report it to an authority. I think that would actually crack down on a lot of the theft that we've seen that are increasingly being released in these national security related indictments. So I think there's a convergence not only of the sense of the risks, but a sense of what's really at stake.
Adam, last words. Are we going to see legislation that actually could command some bipartisan support, do you think, in the next Congress?
I would never want to go on the limb about predicting what Congress is going to do, but I do think there is support for it. As Clete said, I think there are both Republican and Democratic efforts here, and I think that in some ways China might actually drive us to get our act in order, because we do have to bridge the gap with Europe and others to try to work together. And so to the extent that we can decide what it is we're doing at home, it makes it much easier than to turn around and try to shape what's happening abroad.
Okay, and last question for you, Adam, since if Biden were elected, what were the top 3 things that you would have him do right away?
Well, in this realm, I think 5G is the most important play long term. So both continuing the effort to convince allies not to use and spurring domestically innovation and growth. I think we need a greater pushback on the cyber hacking. So what the response is there, the sanctioning indictments don't seem to work. And then finally is what we've been talking about is a kind of domestic set of laws and regulations that deal with data privacy. So then we can then start shaping the international environment.